Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Conference Connections this morning. Just a few things before we get kicked off here. I want to do some quick introductions. My name is Robin Ambrose with NIFA, and then also joining us today is John Turner with NIFA. And then shortly here, we're going to kick it off with Kayla Slater with Hagerty Consulting. And then hopefully around 11 o'clock, we're scheduled to go an hour and a half. And around 11 o'clock, Chris Schroeder with NEMA is going to join us and also join in on the conversation. So we encourage you to ask questions. You can use the question box, and John and I will facilitate those to Kayla. If you have questions as we go along. And but you can also raise your hand if you see the raise your hand button. If you'd rather just ask your question, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can ask your question. So either way. And the other thing before we get going here this morning, we just want to recognize some of the sponsors and exhibitors that would have been at the NIFA conference if we had been able to have it. As everybody knows, we canceled that due to the pandemic, and that's why we're having these online conversations now. But we still want to recognize some of our sponsors and exhibitors. So today we just want to recognize OPPD and QTAC Rock, who were a couple of our sponsors, and then a couple of our exhibitors, which were the Mental Health Association and DICON. And if we have time at the end, we're going to feature a little video from the Mental Health Association that they just made about their program. It's really great information that tells about the work that they do. So I think with that, Kayla, I will turn it over to you. All right, and you should have control.
Okay. I'm not getting the prompt like I did yesterday, Robin, to share my screen.
Okay, let me try that again. Okay, how about now?
Yes, thank you. Okay, perfect. So good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Slater. I'm a Senior Managing Associate with Hagerty Consulting. I'm currently based in Washington, D.C., and I've been supporting the state's long-term recovery and resilience planning efforts as the project manager. So I'm going to spend some time talking to you today a little bit about that planning effort and the work that we've been doing in partnership with the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency, which I'll refer to as NEMA. And then finally, we'll be joined by Chris later on, and he'll give you a little bit more information about what he's been doing to coordinate with the local long-term recovery groups and his work with the local impacts group, which I'll provide an overview of, and really kind of provide a deeper dive on some of the coordination with impacted communities, as well as where the state hopes to go next. So with that, I'm going to get started and just bring you up to speed on a little bit of our history. So Hagerty was brought on specifically to help the state of Nebraska recover from the bomb cyclone and the severe weather and flooding that took place over much of 2019. So as part of that effort, we were working this three sort of phased approach with the state to help ultimately develop a long-term recovery and resilience strategy. So the reason that Hagerty was engaged in this is that we're an emergency management consulting firm. We were founded initially after the September 11th terrorist attacks, and since then we've been supporting most of the major disaster declarations that have happened across the country. So we have sort of two sides of our firm, that we have a a group focused on disaster recovery, specifically the grant management and sort of implementation of recovery processes post-disaster. And then separately, we have a preparedness division, which I'm a member of, and that group is focused on building up communities' capacities to withstand and bounce back from disasters and become more resilient. So we just have some highlights about who we are to provide context as to why we were engaged in Nebraska. Our planning approach for this effort was broken into 3 phases. So what's on screen is all of the deliverables and milestones that were set as part of this effort. I just wanted to show you this because I think it's a pretty good overview of a high level kind of a view of what we were setting out to accomplish in partnership with NEMA. So we were working across 3 phases, and our timeline was roughly September of 2019 to June of this year. So we are trying to push forward with the June 2020 deadline of having that long-term recovery and resilience plan complete. We have been experiencing some slight delays and challenges due to COVID-19, so we may extend into early July, but more or less we are sticking with this timeline. For our presentation today, I wanted to talk about 3 sort of key milestones in this timeline. The first being the identification and engagement of stakeholders within the state of Nebraska. So I'll walk you through what we did, who we engaged, how we worked with them, and what that structure has looked like. Additionally, we performed an assessment of the baseline conditions and disaster impacts to help us understand and contextualize the impacts of the disaster so that we could ultimately build a more effective plan. And then finally, the 3rd phase is developing that long-term recovery and resilience plan. So I'll walk you through why this plan sort of represents best practice based on our understanding of resilience nationally, our previous experience, and then ultimately what that plan will look like. So I'm going to speak to these out of order, and the reason for that being just to sort of set up the conversation in a more natural order. I'm going to speak first to the assessment of the baseline conditions, then stakeholder engagement, and finally the plan. So our first step coming into the project was to perform this assessment of the effects of the disaster on the state of Nebraska as a whole. To do that, we first started with a series of stakeholder interviews with key state agencies, organizations that had been involved in response and recovery from the event. Additionally, we looked at the best data that we had available to us, which was federal data sets where agencies had gone in post-disaster and assessed communities. But we did recognize as we were performing the assessment that these data sets had some limitations. Specifically, the way that the entities that collect the data that we used, which were the Federal Emergency Management Agency and Small Business Administration, they have different mechanisms of collecting data and assessing the damage to homes and assigning a value to those impacts. So there are some discrepancies in how that's collected, and it doesn't represent the damage of an entire neighborhood. It represents just the damage that they've assessed for the homes that applied for assistance. So even with that, those limitations, we tried to make the most out of this data, and what's on the screen is some of our key findings from that assessment. So there's certainly more research and analysis that we did, but when we looked back at the deep dive, these were some of our key takeaways. So we estimated that there may be a potential recovery funding gap of up to $81 million. Lack of affordable housing was already challenging for the state, and that was likely worsened by the disaster, which further decreased the housing stock available. Third, substandard living conditions for those that were either remaining in damaged dwellings or sort of ad hoc treating mold within their homes would present safety challenges in the immediate and sort of intermediate stages of recovery. And that warranted the need for temporary housing solutions that would ultimately make Nebraskans safer. And then finally, our analysis did indicate, and as is to be expected, that long-term housing solutions would include, in some cases, relocation of homes out of high-hazard areas to prevent them from exposure to the conditions that ultimately generated damage in this event. So in other words, relocating homes out of a high-hazard area such as a flood zone would ultimately help the state's long-term resilience. So one of the most significant limitations of the data that we were using was that it doesn't count everyone. Specifically, because we were working with federal data sets that were based on applications, we missed anyone that didn't apply for federal assistance. And we did work with the state and leverage some of the informational resources that were developed prior to Hagerty coming on board. But ultimately, we think that dollar value of $81 million of potential housing need is still not capturing the true impact of that disaster. And some of the reasons for this are that there's lack of participation in those disaster programs. Families can sometimes remain in damaged dwellings and won't seek assistance. It's those discrepancies in the federal data collection processes that I mentioned previously. And then there aren't assessments being performed outside of the areas that are eligible for that type of assistance. Additionally, we kind of expect, based on Hagerty's experience in previous disasters and working with housing recovery in other areas, that there can just be delayed housing needs that are identified. For instance, a very common scenario is one in which a family seeks shelter with a family friend, and that works out for a number of months, but then later the situation gets tense, and then, in 3 months, they're looking for a temporary housing solution. So delayed reporting in situations like that can sort of exacerbate what we thought was the need at the time of shortly after the disaster. Additionally, some families may be able to kind of weather the initial part of the storm and then later be facing an imminent risk of homelessness due to compounded financial constraints. So those are some of the reasons that we think that even though we did the best that we could with the data we had available, we probably still didn't capture the whole picture. I also wanted to note that there is often a misconception of financial assistance after a disaster, that it can be a pretty significant amount. A couple 10 grand coming to a household. And I think that there's commonly a misconception that money will make them whole again, and that's the intent of financial assistance. I really just wanted to drive home that we recognize and have been working with NEMA to sort of understand that those financial assistance, that financial assistance may not go that far, and it may not help families get entirely back on their feet. It really is sort of a temporary stopgap for some of their immediate housing needs. And even with the allocation of community development block grants for disaster relief, which is $108.9 million, that's still a lot of money. I think we actually estimated that the total sort of financial cost of this disaster upwards of $1 billion. So even if we were to allocate that entire pot of money to housing, into just disaster recovery, there's still a lot that needs to be picked up by state and local organizations to truly sort of build back and address all the needs that may exist. On that note, Hagerty has also been supporting the state's efforts to develop the action plan for that funding. And our goal in that project is really just to help sort of develop that plan as quickly as possible. being thorough and providing the justification and meeting the requirements that are necessary so that we can help get that CDBG-DR funding out on the streets as quickly as possible. And we've been working with the Nebraska Department of Economic Development and some of their stakeholders to facilitate that process. So on the next few slides, I wanted to show you some of the ways that we sort of dissected the data that we did have available. So the first thing that you'll notice is that most of the counties in the state are grayed out, and that has to do with the limitation that the data sets that we were working with only covered areas that were eligible for individual assistance or homeowner assistance from the Small Business Administration. So we did try to slice and dice this a few different ways to really understand outside of the sort of obvious calculation of where is the value of damage the highest. I'll walk you through the other ways that we analyzed this data to explain other ways that we sort of tried to identify where there may be additional housing needs or support required. So this first map is showing, as I mentioned, just the total value of verified losses by FEMA and SBA. So that means that they went out to the homes that applied for assistance, they performed an assessment, and they calculated an estimate for the cost to repair that home. Working on this value alone, we get the outcome that Dodge, Douglas, Sarpy, and Cass counties were among the most heavily affected. In our next approach, we tried to look at it a different way. So we tried to adjust the value of that housing damage by comparing it to a pre-disaster baseline. So specifically, we took the value of damage that was assessed by FEMA and SBA as part of their assessments, and then we benchmarked that against pre-disaster property value assessments. So this indicated that Buffalo County became an outlier, where in terms of that comparison, it was well above the remaining counties and was truly sitting at like the extreme category of impact. Behind that, we found that Boyd, Pierce, Thurston, Boone, Nance, Howard, Dodge, and Sarpy counties fell into that next highest category of damage. And then finally, we wanted to overlay other sort of social indicators to get a sense of where there may be additional housing need, even with the limited data that we had. So we borrowed the Social Vulnerability Index from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and we overlaid that with the counties where we identified high damage impacts to housing. So what we found in this analysis is that Dawson, Dodge, and Thurston all fell into this high housing impact and high social vulnerability. And just for context, the Social Vulnerability Index is based on 15 census data indicators. So it's broken out by census tract, and it's looking at things such as poverty, lack of access to transportation, and crowded housing. So this is a fairly standard metric. It was already mapped out for us, so we could quickly adapt it to fit this project, and just provides a sense of how effectively a community can withstand and bounce back from natural and human-caused disasters and pandemics also. So through this analysis and through our engagement with stakeholders, we identified the following goal for housing recovery in Nebraska. And this is really intended just to create sort of a unified vision for what it is we're trying to achieve within the state and what we're working toward as we're restoring, replenishing the housing stock and making the state more resilient. So as part of our engagement with these stakeholders and people across the state that have been supporting housing recovery, early on in our process in late 2019, we asked them to identify some of the milestones that they'd already accomplished when Hagerty sort of entered the scene. So what's represented on the slide is some of those milestones that were identified as accomplished or in progress when Hagerty kicked off our project in September or October last year. I think that it's really important to note that housing recovery specifically is really unique in that it is something that is incredibly slow moving and also highly visible. That it's obvious to someone, you know, living or working in a community that was affected by a disaster, how quickly housing recovery may be going. And it's clear how well it may be progressing, but it is something that across every disaster that I've seen and that some of our more senior level people within the firm, it's just something that takes a long time. And it's obviously going to be complicated when there are compounding disasters such as COVID-19 and instances of civil unrest across the country. So those can all complicate the process as well, that when a new emergency crops up, that's ultimately diverting resources away from something that was already in progress, where we're moving to put out fires as quickly as we can as emergency managers. And I think that it's just really important to understand that this isn't a unique situation to Nebraska, and if it feels like it's moving slowly, it probably is, and you're not alone. That's fairly common across disaster-affected communities. So moving into our stakeholder engagement, I'm going to spend some time just walking through who we've been working with, what are some of the groups that we've established, and the ways in which we've been leveraging their support and their expertise to kind of ground truth the work. When Hagerty came into this project, we by no means wanted to come in and just present as outsiders and tell the state and direct them what to do. So we established a sort of network that we've been working with at the state and local level to validate the approaches in our document and really ensure that the plan and strategy that we're putting forth reflects the needs and desires of representatives across the state. So on our chart, we have the local impacts group, which is essentially an amalgamation of people that represent the local perspective. The Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery is a combination of state entities. I also added the long-term recovery group. And then below that are the 3 recovery support functions that we've established at the state level. I'm sorry, there's just 5 of them. So we wanted to establish this approach and sort of create a structure for not only thinking strategically about disaster recovery and what are the overall sort of cross-cutting goals of the state, but what are some of the really targeted strategies and objectives that we need to set within each of these categories. So specifically, what are some of the housing needs? How are we going to address them? And creating these recovery support functions allows us to really provide space to dig into those issues at a more granular level. So we were intentional about that. And then we also wanted to ensure that there was that strategic direction. The Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery is a combination of representatives across this entire framework, this organizational structure, and it's intended to bring together stakeholders to ensure that we're effectively sharing information across these groups. So that by creating this structure, we created a safe space for those targeted, granular, detail-oriented conversations without creating additional silos that would make it difficult to get information across these groups, because ultimately they do need to work together. And this is an approach that's fairly common, not only within recovery, that the use of recovery support functions and a coordinated approach is something that comes up often in emergency management, both in response and recovery, but it's also a best practice in resilience, that what we're trying to do is facilitate coordination and discussion across agencies, because they all bring expertise on different funding opportunities, different strategies for increasing resilience, different perspectives. So really, the value of creating a group and series of groups like we did is that it creates that cross collaboration, that we not only bring together stakeholders and give them space to sort of identify issues, but are creating a framework for them to work through those together. And recently, in response to the COVID-19, this is something that, again, we've just been seeing crop up, that within Colorado state, they spoke of a few examples on a webinar recently where they're trying to solve the issue of economic recovery related to COVID-19. And one of the first steps that they took was to bring together one of these cross-sectional groups and establish a stakeholder group like the one that we did in Nebraska. So they're focused specifically on economic recovery. So therefore, the group that they've established is an economic recovery group, but it's intended to achieve the same intent, that it's bringing together stakeholders from economic development agencies, private sector, state representatives, and to the extent possible, federal representatives, so that they really get that mix of perspectives and can collaboratively identify solutions. So on the next few slides, I will break down each of these groups and just talk through them briefly, and provide a little bit of background on how we've been working with them in Nebraska. So one of the first things that we got to tap into that was actually already established when Hagerty came on is the Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery. So this is a group of state entities. It was initially formed in 1994 in response to a significant flooding event. And the intent was just to bring together state representatives that had access to different funding, those different perspectives, and to create a space for them to coordinate to ensure that with the rapid injection of money from federal entities, that was being spent responsibly. We weren't duplicating efforts, and ultimately just trying to create sort of a channel for information flow and collaboration that would use that funding as effectively as possible. So when Hagerty came on, there was a housing task force established at the state entity that was many of the representatives that are in the Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery. So we just suggested to sort of rebrand and really tap into the original intent of that group. In doing so, that group has been meeting monthly, and it includes a mix of all of the stakeholders in the org chart from the previous slide. That it's state entities, it's the RSF or Recovery Support Function leaders, it's their partners, it's representatives of the state voluntary organizations active in disaster, the Nebraska Association of County Officials. We've really pulled together a diverse group that I think our membership is between 60 and 100 people. We have a number of people on the distribution list, but the people that we can actually get in a meeting is a little bit lower. So I think my estimate has a wider range. But so as part of this, we also suggested not only do we need the strategic direction of the Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery, but we need the recovery support functions, and we need that space to talk about some of the specific strategies the state can implement to facilitate long-term recovery. So we help the state identify coordinating entities for each of the recovery support functions, but we've really been working with 5 of them, that we haven't seen the need for a coordinated natural and cultural resources response as much. So we've really been focusing on the economy, health and social services, housing, infrastructure, and agricultural recovery. So the reason that we leverage this approach specifically is that it's in alignment to federal doctrine that exists. This is the approach that FEMA is currently using to organize its federal stakeholders and therefore makes coordination easy. And it also represents that best practice in resilience, that it provides a unifying umbrella for stakeholders to come together to address like interests. You'll see just in the way that the organizations are aligned to these recovery support functions, there is a pretty healthy mix of cross-collaboration. So for instance, the Nebraska Department of Economic Development is supporting, obviously, the economic recovery support function in addition to the housing group. And the reason for that being that they oversee the annual CDBG program, as well as the disaster relief funds that were allocated in response to the flooding event. So what's not represented in this chart is that additionally, we have the leads from some of these groups attending other meetings specifically to listen in and keep tabs on information. So for example, the Department of Agriculture, representing that recovery support function, also attends the economic meetings to just sort of participate, listen in, provide feedback where necessary, and see how they can support or tap into their stakeholders. Finally, our local perspective. So when Hagerty first came on, the local long-term recovery groups had already been established. There were 11 in 18 counties supporting individual and household recovery. So we knew that we needed to partner with those groups to effectively understand the needs in impacted communities. So the way that we did that was to create sort of a group that represented that local perspective, in that we established the local impacts group. And that's a mix of some of the state entities that regularly coordinate with local communities, such as the Nebraska Association of County Officials, the Nebraska League of Nebraska Municipalities, and some of those statewide organizations that are directly interfacing with communities and can therefore sort of represent their needs. And so we convened this group for the first time in November of 2019 and sort of set the framework for what it was we were hoping to accomplish with their engagement. Over time, this group has expanded to more explicitly include the long-term recovery groups. Excuse me, and they're working on a bi-weekly basis. So when Chris Schroeder from NEMA joins the line, he'll be able to speak more explicitly about some of that coordination because he's been the one directly overseeing those bi-weekly meetings. But our intent was really to create a place for us to engage that local perspective and to ensure that we could hear from them directly what their needs were and keep tabs on that and ensure that those are reflected in the long-term recovery and resilience plan. The reason that we sort of approached it like this versus going out on a community by community basis is simply just due to limitations of the way that our contract was structured and the time that we had to work with. So we were trying to be as efficient as possible in establishing this group and sort of leveraging it. But it certainly has been helpful for NEMA, especially with the compounding disasters. It's been a helpful place, I think, for people to sort of brainstorm and receive information and resources that they wouldn't have otherwise. One final thing I wanted to note about this group is that we also used them early on in the process to help inform that baseline conditions report. We developed in partnership with some of those state representatives a survey that we distributed called the Periodic Needs Assessment. The intent being that it would be distributed at regular intervals to kind of track how recovery needs are evolving over time. And that information was supremely helpful to sort of just ground truth what we'd identified as our key findings in the document, that local perspective was useful for us to ensure that we truly had captured everything in that research. So finally, our third and final sort of phase of this project is to develop the long-term recovery and resilience plan. So I'm going to start with some background on why we at Hagerty care about resilience and why we believe that it's a responsible practice, because that's really what's underpinning the way that we've approached this document. Ultimately, the reality that we live in is that we are going to be confronted with disasters more frequently, more intense disasters. And I think that 2020 is a great showcase of that. So our goal is to not just put a Band-Aid on disaster recovery and build back exactly the way we were before. We really want to do things smartly and intentionally so that we can help build a community that's stronger in the face of the next disaster. So the way that we sort of can achieve this broadly in emergency management is through the use of hazard mitigation, both planning and implementation of projects, use of insurance, preparedness grants, continuity. So that's what the quote above the image is speaking to. But ultimately, our goal is to sort of reduce the impact of the disaster, where in the image, the red, green, and blue camel humps are representing the level of effort and the length of time that it takes to recover a community. So what's happening over time is that as we increase our resilience, the impact of those disasters on the community is gradually being reduced. And that's really what we're striving for, both here and in all the work that we do in Hagerty. So we've spent some time thinking about this as a company and came up with an approach that we try to bring to bear in all of our projects, where we've identified 5 key steps to build resilience at a community level and at a state level. So the first step being that we empower a champion. And that's essentially saying that we're assigning responsibility to someone to think about resilience. Within the context of this project, that's been a shared responsibility across Hagerty and across NEMA and all of the recovery support function leads. I think Hagerty has tried to ask questions along the way to help stakeholders think about increasing resilience, but I think it's at the same time been a goal of the people that we've been engaging with since we started the project. That wasn't something that we felt we needed to coach people on. It was something that Nebraskans were already thinking about at the time we were engaged. Finally, we want to develop a shared vision. So what is it that we're all trying to achieve, and what is it that we're working toward across the Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery, the recovery support functions, the local impacts group? What is it that we're trying to work toward? And the reason that we want to establish that vision is just that when we do break off and go into those conversations with more detailed conversation with stakeholders to try to figure out how do we fix housing, that we know what the end goal is, and then therefore that end goal can inform those conversations, and we're not duplicating effort, we're not undercutting another group's effort. We really want to be on the same page about how we're building resilience. Third, defining metrics of success. So how is it that we're looking back on what we've done, and how do we say, yes, we've quantitatively increased the resilience of the state. So as part of our planning effort, we've been working with the stakeholders to ask some of these questions, where not only are we identifying the strategy, but we're saying, how can then we measure this in the future? And what do we look back on and say, yes, we accomplished our goal, and here's the evidence that it made a difference, just so that we have a way to sort of measure our progress over time. Fourth is creating and implementing a culture. So really the point of this step in the resilience building process is to really ingrain these tactics in the agencies that we're working with and for. And that across the community, resilience needs to be something that we're thinking about. Otherwise, the chances of it being implemented effectively decrease slightly, that we're more likely to be successful in increasing our ability to withstand future disasters if we're all on the same page about it being a goal of ours and understand how we're working toward that. So this step is really just trying to capture that like building of momentum and understanding of resilience so that we're all working on it together. And then finally, maintaining accountability. So through the assignment of responsibilities, through the way that we're structuring our plans, how are we sort of ensuring that we're not just creating a wish list of things that drops off into the ether over time? So how can we assign things responsibly, and how can we work with that resilience champion to ensure that they're tracking these things and these metrics, and really staying committed to resilience over time, because it does take years before we might start seeing progress. So this outlines Hagerty's sort of framework for thinking about resilience, and I only wanted to cover it to show that this underpins the way that we've been thinking about our planning process here and the way that we've been engaging with Nebraska's state and local entities. And this is what is sort of underpinning the way that we've written the long-term recovery and resilience plan. So as part of this step 2 in sharing a unified vision, we did work with the Governor's Task Force for Disaster Recovery to develop that overarching picture. What is it we're working toward? How do we get there? So this is just a soundbite, but it's intended to sort of quickly summarize the ways that we're trying to implement recovery and become more resilient together. So on this slide, this is an example plan from another jurisdiction. The one in Nebraska is still under development. Otherwise, I would have shown that with you, but we're reworking our format. But this is just a snapshot of what the final product may look like. That I wanted to show that the document we're working on isn't going to be a strategic plan where you have sort of a vision and some bullet points explaining what your common values are. We really wanted to provide the level of detail that you need to effectively implement this plan across the state. So the planning document will include a description of the strategy that's being presented, those measures of success that I described, a description of how it's meeting or helping to address recovery needs within the state, what value the project has or the strategy has in helping to effect long-term resilience and facilitate the sorts of positive changes that we're looking for. It also will identify leads and partners for every strategy. So we've been working with the stakeholders in the recovery support functions to identify who is helping to coordinate the implementation of the strategy and who are all of the partners that can help support the implementation. So that's been a bulk of our conversations with those stakeholders recently, is to help really figure out responsibility for the strategies that will be presented in the plan, the tactics for implementing the strategies they've identified, as well as the timeline for implementation. So ultimately, our goal is to provide a timeline that's sort of phased and breaks things out into manageable chunks. So that's been a bulk of our engagement with the recovery support functions over the past few months, especially with COVID-19. We have transitioned to fully virtual meetings, and so we've been having to use our time together very efficiently, and we've been focusing very heavily on the development of this planning document so that we can stick to our timeline. But again, just to underscore, our goal in doing all of this work and taking this time from the stakeholders, which we're very grateful for, is to develop something that ultimately the state of Nebraska can run with upon completion of the project. So we're trying to be really diligent about engaging people and about ensuring that they're bought into what's going to be in that final version of the plan. Over the past 2 weeks specifically, we've been holding one-on-one meetings with some of our stakeholders to really dig into those tactics and to validate the approaches and those measures of success. So we are very close to the end of our planning process. Our deadline for feedback from our stakeholders is this Friday, and then we'll take the next few weeks to just finalize the document, migrate it into a format that's more visually appealing than the one that it is in currently. And then finally, that should be packaged up and ready to go toward the end of this month or early July. So I wanted to just end here on this note that although June, early July represents the end of Hagerty's journey with the state of Nebraska in terms of long-term recovery planning, in many ways, it is just the beginning of your long-term recovery effort, and that there's so much work remaining to actually implement the strategies in the plan, to execute the tactics that we've identified, and to measure success over time. And all of that being to also help the community understand how we're making progress and how they can continue to support long-term recovery efforts. So it's been a privilege so far to participate in this process and to get to know a lot of the stakeholders that we've been working with. And I'm very excited to see what comes next for Nebraska. So we are rooting for you at Hagerty, and we'll continue to be involved with the action planning effort and some of the other federal grant management efforts as well. And we hope to stay engaged for as long as we can. But I think that's all I had prepared for today. So I was wondering if there are any questions.
Hi, Kayla.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I see we have a question. Did you see that, Robin?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Okay. So this question is, how did Hagerty address the issues related to rural housing valuations when developing estimates of housing damage and recovery needs? That's the first question. How did this shape recovery plans? Issues such as small markets, housing deficits due to lack of investment, substandard housing, housing value influenced by land value. So we can take that in pieces if you want, but that's a pretty good question.
This is a good question. Yeah. So I think in terms of the baseline conditions assessment, I do think this is one of the areas where we were really lacking data to effectively tell that story. So I think that these rural housing needs are truly captured best in that invisible housing need. So I'm not sure that it's in our report to the extent that we were able to quantify it, but it is a known issue within the state and across our stakeholders that I know for sure that there's a strategy within the housing section of the long-term recovery and resilience plan that's intended to get at this issue specifically, where we understand that it's there's not necessarily a strong incentive for development in a rural area. So we've been working with the housing recovery support function and the stakeholders in that group to effectively identify some tactics to help chip away at that problem. That how can we coordinate across the state entities that are supporting recovery and across the local community representatives such as voluntary organizations and the long-term recovery groups to share information about where rural housing needs are greatest and sort of partner together to make that sort of investment in those sorts of projects more appetizing or of a greater incentive.
Very good. Let's see. We have an outstanding presentation, Kayla. Was there an emphasis on encouraging households out of flood zones due to repetitive flooding?
Yes. So this is something that we've been working with the state on across all of the projects. This has come up in every, Hagerty is currently supporting some of the management of the federal grants and just providing support for helping with that application and distribution of funding. We're also supporting the action planning effort and this long-term recovery effort. And we have internally a call every 2 weeks to discuss the sort of priorities and needs across those projects to ensure that we're working together effectively to help address those needs. So within the mitigation kind of sphere, it's certainly been something that the state is working with local communities to review those applications and help direct funding in a way that will help communities do that. It's also a priority for the action planning that some of the money within the housing funding program may help to do that, but that document is still a work in progress, so I don't want to overpromise there, but definitely it's been evident throughout our conversations that there is a need for that. And that at the state level, there is a recognition of that need and support for that type of action to reduce future hazard exposure.
Okay, let's see. Does Hagerty provide implementation of HMP for flood buyouts here in Nebraska?
At the time, no. We've been primarily supporting the implementation of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is administered by the state. So we've not been implementing planning as much, but it is a service that we offer in other communities. We just haven't found our way into Nebraska yet.
Okay. Well, one thing I just wanted to say was I appreciated in your presentation the balance of the human side of this and the infrastructure side, and talking about the struggles that people have, and how, you know, it's not just about getting a big check to try to help rebuild your life when you probably feel like you've lost everything. One of the things, I used to work in a behavioral health field, and I know that there's a behavioral health disaster kind of system in Nebraska through the regional behavioral health authorities. Have you had much work with them and the funding they've received to help these families and individuals?
So I don't know specifically of that entity. They may be represented and I'm just not familiar, but behavioral health has been a big topic of concern, not only from the Health and Social Services group who deals with that on a more day-to-day basis, but it was an especially hot topic within the agricultural recovery support function, which was maybe surprising. But there was a push on both ends to really identify resources and support for individuals that had gone through the disaster and needed that sort of behavioral mental health support. So we ended up consolidating the recommendations from that group into one section within the long-term recovery and resilience strategy, but have outlined what are some of the efforts that were already in place and where do they help to build or expand or further publicize those resources so that we can reduce the stigma of seeking that type of assistance and ensure that the individuals affected are getting the support they need, especially given that those issues specifically take a long time to manifest. There may be an immediate uptick, but then there's usually a swell at the 1 year or 18-month mark where those sorts of things come up again. So we've been gearing up for that. And I understand that that also informed the state's decision to pursue a disaster declaration related to COVID-19, that declaration would make that sort of financial assistance available and continue providing financial support for those types of efforts to provide behavioral mental health support.
Great.
And it looks like we got another question. This one is, are there any accountable mechanisms to ensure households are building back with resiliency in mind? Building material, such as building material, drainage, and green space.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to run down the list in my head. I don't know that there's a specific mandate or anything. I know it's been, it's been part of our conversations, and we've also identified sort of a cross-cutting strategy to just look critically at the policies and regulatory mechanisms that are currently in place within the state to help state and implementing organizations understand what those regulations are so that they can either navigate them more effectively and efficiently, or to try to streamline those processes in their implementation to support a faster recovery. So I think from a strategic perspective, certainly that would be encapsulated in that sort of strategy. But I don't know that we specifically said, here's some considerations for the types of materials or things that we've accounted for in the planning document yet. But I'm maybe, Robin, am I forgetting something? that's come up in the housing group? Is there anything you would add as the recovery support function lead?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it all.
Okay, great.
Kayla, as we're waiting to see if any more questions come in here, I know, would you mind just touching upon the CDBG DR funding and that process just briefly, since I know people might be interested in hearing about an update on that, just since some of that funding will be available for housing efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. So where we are in that process generally is that we've submitted the final sort of full draft of the action plan to the Department of Economic Development. So they're doing a final sort of internal review and giving us the either some additional revisions to incorporate or the green light to proceed with the next step in the process, which is to make that document available to the public and then present it to the public via some virtual meetings. So right now we're targeting mid-June for those meetings, assuming we can stick to our timeline. But it has certainly been challenging to balance. DED's been really overwhelmed with the injection of CARES Act funding related to coronavirus relief. So that's been sort of the balance for them to juggle both the ongoing recovery and the dollars that they just received and to distribute those to communities too. So that's made our timeline a bit more flexible, that we're trying to be accommodating and allow them to put out the fires as they come up, and also the time they need to truly read through and process the document as it's been developed. But I think so far so good. We're hoping for that June timeline, and additional information should be available through the Department of Economic Development when it does go public.
Thank you.
I guess, yeah, I don't want to forget that when it finally does go public, there will be a 30-day window for public comment. So it won't be like a 24-hour turnaround. You'll have some time to digest and go through the document, as it's quite extensive.
Okay. Any other questions that anyone in the audience might have that's listening in? Feel free to type them in or just raise your hand.
I will take this opportunity to note that I added our recovery email address to the slide. If you forget any questions that you have and want to send them to us later, we monitor this email along with ours, so we're checking it on a daily basis. And we'd be happy to take any questions you have about any of the work that we're doing, whether it's action planning or the long-term recovery and resilience framework. Feel free to sort of stay in touch with us if there's anything that we can help with.
Well, I think we're still waiting for our other presenter. One of the things that has come up is, I know it's home ownership awareness month, and flood insurance is something I know that is discussed a lot, especially folks that didn't have it and maybe now are, people are rethinking what that is. Can you talk a little bit about your experience through this process with flood insurance and how that impacts everyone?
Yes. So this is actually, it was a topic that we identified early on as needing to cover through our stakeholder interviews with the Department of Natural Resources. And then actually through the economic recovery support function, they also identified a need for that sort of targeted outreach. So one of the outcomes of the planning process that I think has been interesting to see is this new sort of partnership emerge between the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Economic Development, where they have a strategy in the plan that's intended to really create more awareness of the ways that flood insurance can benefit homeowners and businesses, So they're working together to sort of execute an outreach strategy to promote uptake of that insurance. And it's also evolved over the sort of manifestation of COVID that it was initially very focused on flood insurance specifically, and has since sort of evolved to encapsulate business interruption insurance and cyber destruction insurance as well, as people have just been thinking about continuity of operations more generally due to the disruptions associated with COVID. And yeah, certainly the Department of Natural Resources has been very involved in our conversations. They were one of the stakeholders that we sat down with one-on-one to just discuss and understand some of the ways in which they're already promoting this goal, and they're trying to create awareness of flood risk. And so they have some great maps developed already and great data available to the public, but they're in the process of updating their hazard mitigation plan. I'm sorry, that's NEMA's plan, but it's in the process of being updated. And along with that, DNR is overseeing the updating of some of the maps that show risk, and they're working to make more data available to the public, not only just for sort of a general understanding of risk, but specific to the flooding, and to show where impacts were experienced that may be outside of that special flood hazard area.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Doesn't look like any other questions. Oh, good timing.
Perfect timing, Chris. All right. We were just answering a few questions, Chris, because Kayla has finished up with her presentation, and so now that you've joined us, I think we'll turn it over to you to give an update from NEMA's perspective. And do you have slides at all, Chris? You don't, right?
I don't.
I've got one.
Yeah, Kayla was kind enough to prepare that one for me, but that's really all I have.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us, Chris. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Good morning, everybody. Chris Schroeder, Nebraska Emergency Management Agency here. I appreciate your patience this morning with me. My schedule's been all over the place today, but I was able to connect with Kayla earlier and just get a sense for what she was going to be speaking to and presenting on this morning, and to sort of fill in a bit with where we as a state emergency management agency are and where we have been and where we're going. The bottom line up front is that disasters as well as recovery and long-term recovery begin and end at the local level. And that's where everything starts, where everything ultimately stops. And last year, as you've heard, with the March 2019 flooding here in Nebraska, the flooding began around March 8th in some places, and then in the weeks following, the months following in other areas. A federal emergency was declared, which means that the event itself, the disaster, rose above the state's capability to effectively respond, and we had to send it up the chain to our federal partners and the federal government to help assist and intervene in the recovery for our state and its people. That state of emergency was declared and was in place until July of last year. But even by FEMA's own admission, it should have been in place until almost October of last year. There are places in Nebraska where the floodwaters are still not fully receded. There are levees that are still needed in repair, big infrastructure type projects that are still underway. And as I know Kayla has mentioned and spoken to already, these sorts of things tend to take time, despite our best efforts and despite all of the well-intentioned people and agencies and organizations wanting to help and do everything that we can to fix everything right now and immediately. It's a very large ship to turn and to steer. But we're still trying, and people at federal, state, and local levels are all trying. It feels like the flooding began March of last year, quite a long time ago, and in many respects it did. But remembering that the state of emergency was in place until July and should have been in place until October, we are still right now today less than a year removed from that state of emergency, and really only 8 months into the recovery from this flood. Disaster events of any kind, be it a flood, a wildfire, a tornado, hurricane, whatever the case may be, follow similar signposts. There are 3 large phases of any disaster event: rescue, response, and recovery. As you might guess, rescue is quite literally pulling people to safety, pulling them out of harm's way. Response is addressing the short-term needs of people in communities: food, clothing, shelter, above all else. And then recovery is the more long-term systemic needs: housing, financial security, food security, which, is just one instance of these things not being black and white. Food security, of course, is one of those things that is very much also a short-term need. But disasters tend to follow those paths of rescue, response, and recovery. But in terms of timelines, they increase by a factor of 10 typically. The general rule is that if a rescue phase of a disaster takes 3 days, then a response phase takes 10 times that, 30 days, which means that the recovery phase ultimately takes 10 times that, 300 days. And with respect to last year's flooding here in Nebraska, we had an event that began in March and an emergency declaration that lasted until July, but should have lasted until October. And that's more than 200 days, March to October, which means that following that same rule, the recovery phase should take more than 2,000 days or close to 6 years. And that sounds very, insert your own adjective there, but it's not ideal for people in need. And that's why we prioritize immediate short-term needs first, and then needs accordingly from there. To give you a sense of perspective, to give you a sense of scope, and a bit about how these long-term recovery disaster events can last, the city of New Orleans is still technically recovering from Hurricane Katrina. The city of New York still has projects open in recovery from 9/11, almost 20 years ago. Now, that's not to say that this flooding here in Nebraska will be on a similar timeline or anything of the sort. No 2 disasters are alike, but if anything, that hopefully gives you a bit of a sense of perspective on how long these things can take depending on the scope. And last year's flooding here in Nebraska had a humongous scope. There are 93 counties here in the state, and 84 of them were a part of that disaster declaration. With all that, and all of that to say, this is the reason why the long-term recovery and resilience plan that Kayla has been talking about is so important. We have taken that recovery time from October until now to begin to pick up the pieces, and in many ways pick up the pieces themselves, but assess what needs to be done and how best to do it so that we can grease the wheels and take that potential 6-year timeline and really speed it up to help people and get people the help that they need as immediately as possible. And with that comes one of the other big themes of disaster recovery, which is communication, the most important piece of all this, but also a lot of times the most difficult piece to effectively implement. The plan itself that we are working on and that we have been working with federal, state, and local partners to verify and to make as comprehensive as possible, not just regarding last year's flooding, but with resilience and mitigation in mind, preparing for whatever may come next and any disasters in the future as much as we can. that communication, those sharing of knowledge and resource conversations that are and have been happening are so important, so that we can understand the tasks involved in doing all this. Unclear tasks cannot be clearly executed. And that's really been the underlying message of all this, is what we've done, a sample of what we've done perhaps, but also what still needs to happen so that we can ultimately close the book on the 2019 flooding here in Nebraska. But with that comes a very harsh reality, in that disasters do not wait until the last one is fully closed out before they happen. Just look at what's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic right now. It's not happening in a vacuum, just like the flood didn't happen in a vacuum. We here at NEMA are still closing out projects for communities in Nebraska from 3 disasters ago. And that will continue to be the pattern. That's just the pattern for disaster recovery, despite all of the resources on the table and in play. Information silos, communication, knowledge silos make everybody's lives a bit more difficult, because they create inefficiencies. They create gaps and holes in the field. And what neither I nor Kayla or Hagerty or anybody is trying to do is pull people out of their lanes and, say, Rob and NIFA, you all do some great work with housing, but now we need you to tackle agriculture. Nothing of the sort. You all are the subject matter experts in your field, and that's why we need you. But there are efficiencies and operations that you all are already underway doing that could make that group or that agency's life a bit easier as they also recover from this event. And what we can do is collaborate and not necessarily pool our resources, but make each other aware of what we have access to, what we are aware of, what is on the table, so that if you all can address that problem, then we can address this one. And we're not playing both sides against the middle, financially, logistically, or otherwise. And really, to circle back to my original point, that ultimately ends up at the local level. And it begins there with the long-term recovery groups and with their disaster case managers and with the disaster case management processes that are underway and have been happening since last year for the flooding. Kayla, I believe, mentioned that there are 11 long-term recovery groups active in the state of Nebraska, influencing needs for people and for communities across 18 of the 93 counties. And those are 18 of the hardest hit counties with regard to last year's flooding. But there are also other areas where Nebraska Extension, Department of Agriculture, agricultural stakeholders, and producers have been pressed into case management type roles on top of everything else they're already doing, because they have a vested interest in their community and they just want to help people. And those disaster case managers are the linchpins. Those long-term recovery groups and those non-government organizations at the local level are the catalyst for change, the boots on the ground. And if a disaster event is the coal mine, they are the canaries. They can identify problems before they become big problems. And thankfully, we've got folks like NIFA and other agencies at the state level that have their ear to the ground through the governor's task force to be able to say, we hear this problem is happening there, but we also hear it's happening in these 3 other areas and is probably most likely happening around the rest of the state as well. What can we do to coordinate our efforts so that we're not only influencing where we hear it right now, but influencing the situation before it becomes a problem in these other areas? Because those groups may not be aware of it yet, they may not be thinking that way just yet, but it is a problem on the horizon that's emerging in these counties, not yet in those, but we can prepare them and build up their capacity, their knowledge, their training, so that there's a grassroots level of experience, be it firsthand or secondhand, to better prepare them for what's coming and perhaps even the next disaster event. At the same time, though, these disaster case managers can only do so much. The recommended caseload is that any disaster case manager carry with them around 30 cases at any one time. That can be a bit difficult, a bit of a difficult line in the sand to draw for these individuals because in my experience, disaster case managers view their role not necessarily as a job, but more as a calling. They are there to help people and help people as immediately as they can. So they tend to stretch themselves beyond that 30 caseload capacity. And in some cases, even right now, are doing that to the tune of 60, 70, 80 cases per case manager. And with that, I should mention that these cases have varying levels of need. You know, that particular case might be a family of 4 or 5 that needs their home entirely rebuilt. This other case may be a husband and wife who have very specific needs and repairs needed to their home. This other one might be a man or woman, a gentleman or lady that lives by themselves that has other access or disability related needs and, you know, does not necessarily need repairs to their home, but a handicap ramp built, something of that sort. So there is a whole spectrum of needs, not just home repair and replacement related either, that these cases can fall across. But with that comes its own difficulties in that case managers tend, in my experience, because I could say this because I've been a case manager myself and I've managed case managers myself. They tend to think, well, you know, that might be case number 31 for me, but it's a really simple and small one, so I can take on one more beyond that, and one more beyond that, and one more beyond that. And unfortunately, what that leads to is what's called disaster fatigue, where these people are very often in the course of recovery some of the first to experience burnout, because they are quite literally the boots on the ground as far as recovery goes, but also in constant communication with all 30 or 60 or however many of these individuals and families they are working alongside at any one time. And very often they're drawing a lot of fire because they are having to communicate to these families the fact that, well, we reached out to FEMA and we're still waiting on it. And we've been waiting on some time, but we appreciate your patience. And these families tend, especially in the course of long-term recovery, to be in very desperate situations. So their frustration is not necessarily with the case manager, but just with the circumstances. It tends to get directed toward the case manager though. So thankfully, the long-term recovery groups we have here in Nebraska who have and are still working toward flood recovery from last year have been amazing at not only taking care of themselves, but taking care of each other so that they can continue to help those in their community. And that's where also the governor's task force, state and federal resources and assistance can help ease that burden, provide some assistance to the case managers, to the groups themselves, so that they can also continue to do what they do best and help the people, their friends, neighbors, they live right beside. We take what we have and help as many as we can, but that means also that not everybody gets the help they need right away. And that can be very frustrating, especially when you're sitting in the office and family after family, individual after individual is coming through the door needing help. It can be very difficult to make an informed decision with that thing between your ears and not the one pumping in your chest. And it is a struggle, and it is a struggle that is ongoing that these groups are having to deal with on almost a daily basis. They may receive funding and donations that amount to a brand new house for a family in need, but it's enough for one house, and they've got a laundry list of families that need a house. And it becomes a question of, well, how do you make that decision? And what they try to do to the best of their ability is prioritize needs. That is a husband and wife in their 30s who are able-bodied and healthy. This other one is an elderly couple with disabilities and with special needs. This family's got kids. The cases vary substantially. But that's where collaboration, communication, about needs, about resources, knowledge, plays such an integral role. But with that, right now, with the current landscape, COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic has hampered that communication quite a bit. Unsurprisingly, with the directed health measures here in Nebraska and across the country, across the world, progress toward that full recovery from last year has been slowed to a crawl. There are groups, there are nonprofits, contractors that have been able to continue with home repairs, home replacements in a number of communities within the guidelines and the parameters of the directed health measures, but because of those, they are operating as an individual or in groups of 2, 3, no more than 5, really. Which means that construction takes longer than intended, which means that operating costs are even higher. And with that, construction costs across the entire construction industry have been increasing steadily since September of last year. So what that means for the nonprofits and for these groups is that they can only stretch themselves so far. They can only help so many people because they are having to stretch their budgets further than they intended. But at the same time, for the families, especially those who are hoping to be back in their homes or in a new home or in a fully repaired home this spring, those timelines are also out the window, which means that their budgets are no longer operable, which means that what had been a temporary solution, this temporary housing solution or temporary utility bill payment solution, is now a large problem, which means that cases are being reopened or cases that were in stages of being closed out are no longer. And the pace at which cases had been getting closed out and families, individuals had been fully recovered, all their needs met, has dropped off by about 60 some odd % from prior to COVID-19 and prior to the pandemic. Before then, across the state of Nebraska, almost 75 cases a month were being closed out. And now that number is closer to 20. I think that math is correct, but I've always been bad at math. It's a moving target too. And with things opening back up and these directed health measures less restrictive now, the needle is continuing to move back in the direction we'd like, but not nearly as quickly as we would like. Although we are beginning to put pieces in place with resilience in mind and mitigation in mind to get us back up to where we were before. Volunteers, donations are able to help with that and impact those gaps, those needs, those burdens. But at the same time, right now, this is the time of the year where the demand for volunteer services, not just in home repairs, but across all fields, is at its peak. So there are not as many resources available right now as there normally would be or as there should be. But my message to these groups has been and continues to be throughout this pandemic and our response to it is to control the controllables. That's been my mantra for the last couple of months at least. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the new normal looks like and what even the next month or a month from now will look like, or what may happen in the fall or at the end of this year. But I have been urging and helping these groups understand that they cannot get themselves bogged down in those questions and those unknowns. The important thing is to control what they can control and move forward every day, make a little bit of a step forward every day, and then ultimately we will be back to running the way that we were before. There are a lot of conversations about what may happen before all is said and done with COVID-19. If we're lucky, it won't come back and resurge in the fall. But these groups, without even having to be told, have been moving forward regardless and sort of taken up the idea that what we do is not built upon luck. It is not dependent on luck. Luck is the last hope of those who believe that victory happens by accident. And that's not how we operate. That's not how we're able to help people. And it's only through just action, even a little bit of progress every day is still progress. And that's been sort of in microcosm the recovery effort from the very beginning. It's sort of risen to the surface recently, but it's been the underlying message, the underlying tone and mentality since March of last year when the flood happened, and across the recovery field for years and years. Flexibility, adaptability is key, right with that communication, just not quite knowing what may come any given day, but understanding that there will be some curveballs thrown, there will be some unforeseen issues or hurdles in place, but that's, again, where that communication comes in. That's where that flexibility and that idea that they are not in this on their own plays such a huge piece. And the beginning and the end of that is the long-term recovery and resilience plan, which helps not only locals, but state agencies, federal partners, and stakeholders across the board understand that we have to do this together, otherwise it's not going to happen. So that's really all I've got right now, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Chris. We really appreciate that that update and your comments. We're just kind of giving it a minute here to see if anybody types in any questions or raises their hand. So if anybody has any questions for Chris, please feel free to go ahead and type them in the question box or raise your hand. Not seeing any come in yet. Fantastic presentation, Chris. That was one of the comments. So, Chris, what's been one of your? I have a question for you. What's been one of your like biggest takeaways that from all of this that was kind of an aha moment or something that you really have learned in all your work with all these communities? What's been one of the big takeaways that you have is what communities can do to be prepared or you know, better position themselves before the next disaster comes?
That's a great question. Something that I have learned a bit of an aha moment that I think on some level I already knew and that I could see in practice with these groups that are on the ground is simply the idea that no two communities are alike. And every community has its own culture, has its own identity, has its own way of life and people. And with that comes its own needs in the wake of a disaster event. Even adjacent communities are going to have perhaps wildly different needs following a flood like we had last year, or a tornado, whatever the case may be. And the key to that, the key to understanding that what works for this community won't work exactly the same way for that one, is simply meeting these people where they are and sort of beginning the conversation there. And really it comes back to just listening, but understanding that these people have been through a disaster, they've been through a life-changing event, and hearing their story and understanding where they're coming from and what they are experiencing in that moment. They might not want to talk about what they've been through, what they're feeling emotionally, but you can see perhaps with the home that they're living in what needs to be done. But the circumstances are going to be a bit different, but the principles are still the same. If this, I'm not sure if I'm making any sort of sense. Meeting people where they're at and listening are the keys. And I like I said, I feel like I knew that, but I had to sort of see other people practicing it on their own without me or anybody else having to tell them to really understand the impact of that. Because you've got communities around Omaha and Douglas County that are doing some amazing work. And there are other communities in Dawson County, Buffalo County, Boyd County that are equally in need, but are trying to replicate exactly what's happening in those other areas and aren't quite certain why it's not working for them. And it's because the community is different, the needs are different, the people are different. And perhaps taking that same approach, doing those exact same steps, A, B, C, D, will work, but you need to tailor it to the community itself. And on a bigger scale, there are best practices for disaster recovery and guidance for all of these things, for individual assistance, for all the programs from FEMA and from a federal level that are published nationwide. But with that, and through the governor's task force, through the long-term recovery and resilience plan, we've been able to take those guidances and tailor them to Nebraska and make them state-specific, Nebraska site-specific, so that they are still the best of what our federal partners and friends can offer and effective fully for our friends and neighbors here in state.
Great, thank you, Chris, for that. We have one other question that's come in, and it is, was there a formal process for NEMA caseworkers to share their on-the-ground data with the project that the plan that Hagerty has done? And I know the answer to that is yes, so excuse me, I'll let you address it though.
Yes, there has been a number of means and channels by which these groups have been able to share their data, their experiences, and what they've seen as far as trouble spots or bottlenecks or whatever the case may be with myself, with the Hagerty team, with the state partners. And the biggest channel by which they've been able to do that is through the local impact group, the committee under the governor's task force that has served as a conduit between state and federal levels and the local level and what's going on a day in and day out basis. I've been trying to sit in on as many of their long-term recovery group meetings as I can in all these communities. And through those conversations, I've been able to glean some data of my own and then confirmed it with them so that we are painting as accurate a picture as possible. But it goes back to that communication piece, and sometimes, requesting some information from them just to ensure that the details are right. But they have been very forthcoming and very selfless in offering everything that they've seen and that they're going through at the local level with us to help inform this plan.
Great, okay. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in at this time. Just a couple more comments about thanking you and Kayla for your presentations and that it's great information. So I just want to echo those comments and say thank you to both of you for joining us this morning. And Chris, I know your schedule is very busy, so we appreciate you jumping in here after you finished your last meeting, and appreciate all the information that was shared. I just want to add that we'll be posting Kayla's presentation and then a recording of this on our website, so you can check that out if you want to rewatch it or grab some information off the PowerPoint that Kayla had. And so with that, I know we're a few minutes over, but we wanted to share a video from one of our partners and one of our exhibitors from the conference. And so while this is not flood recovery, but it is something that it's an inspiring video, and we just want to share it because I think we could all use a little bit more of that right now. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay.
So that you can share that video, and everybody, if you'd like to stay on and watch the video, that'd be great. Or if you need to jump off, we understand because I know we're a few minutes over. But again, thank you everybody so much.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay.
Hollow house for me. I didn't have nowhere to go. And if I didn't come here, what would I have done? If Hollow House didn't open their arms to me for me to come here, I could be in trouble right now. I could have made a lot of bad decisions.
We're focused on men and women coming out of state correctional facilities here in Nebraska with mental health and addiction issues. People coming out, they just need the extra support. People inside, they are so motivated and ready and have all these really great ideas of what they want to do when they get out and where they want to go. But then they figure out that there's a lot of barriers.
I've done 27 years in prison. No matter how much I wanted to be free, I wasn't ready for it.
I was charged with conspiracy to sell manufactured drugs, and I ended up getting 5 to 8 years. So I done 2.5 years, and then when I got out, I came here. Opened the door, and there was the first thing I gotta say is a big closet. And then I had a bed. I had blankets for that bed. I had sheets for that bed. There was curtains in my room. It was fully furnished. All it needed was me. No one's going to cry.
I came from a prison that's hostile. When I came here, everybody was too nice. Like when I first got here, I probably didn't sleep for like 8 days in a row. The people here had reassured me, well, look, what you're going through is normal for somebody to be locked up that long.
If you have no income, this place will help you. They will supply the laundry room where you can wash your clothes. Say you're trying to get an apartment, they go all out to help you. This place is awesome. It's really awesome.
We have staff that will jump on a bus with someone and just show them the routes they need to take to get to their doctor, get to work. %85 of our individuals who went through our employment program through reentry, they are still working. We've never had a violent incident. We've never had like a chair thrown, a hole punched in the wall, nothing like that. And that's because people are here voluntarily.
I feel respected here, and they're doing everything they can to help me get to where I need to be.
My mother and father and all my grandparents, 2 of my sisters, they all died since I've been in prison. And this is my extended family. They show me the same love that I get from my mother. The second chances that my mother gives me.
All right. Well, thanks, John, for sharing that video, and hopefully everybody could see it okay. But again, it was just that's the Mental Health Association. They were one of our exhibitors that we're going to be at the NIFA conference, and they're also one of our outreach partners. And we just wanted to highlight them today and share their story. So again, thank you to Chris and Kayla for joining us today, and for all of you that were listening in. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event, which is next Wednesday. It's our networking with NIFA event, and we'll be hearing about the coordinated entry system for the homeless that the homeless continuum of cares use, which will be some really great information. So we hope you can join us then. and hope everybody has a great day and stay safe and take care.